Hello everyone! As you have seen from the title of this video, today we're here to talk about 5 directors that you probably don't know approached film noir. For those of you who are already fascinated with movies from Fritz, Otto Preminger, Robert Siodmak or Jules Dassin, just to name a few of the most prominent directors of film noir, there are also a bunch of filmmakers that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the genre and whose names more often than not tend to get overlooked. As probably many of you would know, back in the studio system in the golden age of Hollywood, there were many professionals, consummate directors who were used and perfectly capable of handling practically any type of genre or style of movie. Such was the case, in my opinion, of directors like Michael Curtiz, whom we've mentioned a lot of times in this channel, or Mervyn LeRoy, a director whose name is nowadays I think practically forgotten, but who also falls in that category of a director who made very fine movies no matter or almost no matter the genre. When film critics started to pay a lot of attention to auteur filmmakers, I think several of these professionals I just mentioned and others that I will talk about in this video fell practically into oblivion.
Did you ever want to forget anything? Did you ever want to cut away a piece of your memory or blot it out?
Well, today we're here to do a bit of justice and talk about these other professionals who were in some instances indeed associated with a specific genre, but they were capable of much more because they also directed some very good examples of film noir. With this video, my intention is to yet again talk about film noir. Who needs an excuse for that? While we're paying a little tribute to these professionals that I think tend to get a little bit lost and hopefully to have a great time. So with no more ado, let's round up the unusual suspects. The first director that I want to mention in today's video is probably the one whose name gets to be mentioned the least, I think, and is none other than William Dieterle. Probably his name doesn't even ring a bell, but William Dieterle was one of those very efficient professionals who emigrated from Europe, from Germany to be specific, to Hollywood, where he started his career in the early 30s, earning throughout his life a reputation for being a very fine filmmaker. Sadly though, and is probably one of the reasons why his name is not as well remembered as other filmmakers, is because he was blacklisted, sadly, towards the 50s, eventually returning to Germany towards the later half of the decade. To give you a bit of a background on William Dieterle, he started as an actor initially for the theater company belonging to Max Reinhardt, whom I have mentioned in previous videos, who was a very prominent Austrian-born theater producer who had a fantastic reputation, and he eventually ended up working in Hollywood. William Dieterle initially, as I was saying, combined supporting parts with his intention to eventually becoming a director. As you can imagine, due to the political situation in Germany in the 30s, he emigrated to the United States and he started his career in Hollywood also first with bit parts as an actor until he got hired by Hal Wallis for Warner Brothers. His previous collaboration with Max Reinhardt proved to be very auspicious because he got him, in fact, his first big break, recommending him to direct the production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, released in 1935, incidentally the first movie in which Olivia de Havilland appeared in. Towards the end of the 30s, William Dieterle went on to direct a couple of biopics featuring Paul Muni. One was the story of Louis Pasteur, released in 1936, and the other, The Life of Émile Zola, in 1937. And then he also got a fantastic box office and critical success with the adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, released in 1939, and featuring Charles Laughton, Maureen O'Hara, Thomas Mitchell, Edmund O'Brien, that was again hugely acclaimed. Getting towards the juicy part, his legacy in film noir comes partly from being again one of the European emigres that contributed hugely to the expressionist atmosphere, bringing a different kind of narrative style that gelled very well with what was happening in the world, although he didn't have probably such a prominent part in it as other directors such as Fritz Lang. Still, William Dieterle was part of that. Hinting towards the start of film noir, he made movies like Dr. Socrates based on material from writer William Riley Burnett.
It's news when the author of Little Caesar writes a new novel, because he's one writer whose rapid-fire, punch-packed stories never fail to thrill the public. His latest effort, Dr. Socrates, is a real hair-raiser, based on recent underworld history.
Another movie that William Dieterle directed and that was also hinting towards film noir was Satan Met a Lady, a movie released in 1936 and starring Warren Williams and Bette Davis. That is a very, very loose adaptation of Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. After having worked throughout all these years in Warner Brothers, towards the late 1940s he found himself working for Paramount Pictures, and although he never achieved the success he found in Warner Brothers, still he directed some fine examples of the genre, such as The Accused, released in 1949 and starring Loretta Young, Dark City, released in 1950, featuring Elizabeth Scott and Dean Jagger, and a young Charlton Heston in his film debut, and lastly, my favorite, The Turning Point, released in 1952, starring William Holden, Edmund O'Brien, and Alexis Smith. Sadly, as I said, his work declined towards the second half of the 50s, so again, even though he's not probably that well remembered today, still the contribution of William Dieterle to film noir and to cinema in general is quite substantial. Another director who might be also a bit overlooked was Delmer Daves. Born in San Francisco, he worked in many genres, but again, I think westerns are his most remembered productions, such as Broken Arrow, The Last Wagon, or 3:10 to Yuma, one of my personal favorites. Delmer Daves started off first as a prop boy, then a technician, eventually working as a screenwriter and collaborating in movies such as The Petrified Forest, Love Affair, or You Were Never Lovelier. In 1943, he made his directorial debut with the movie Destination Tokyo, a war drama featuring Cary Grant and John Garfield, for which he also co-wrote the screenplay. After directing a bunch of war-related movies, towards the second half of the 40s, he started to gravitate a little bit towards film noir, and he made films like The Red House, released in 1947, which plays out more, I should say, as a thriller rather than film noir, but the influence of the atmosphere is heavy. Then Delmer Daves wrote and directed a movie called Dark Passage, which was another vehicle for Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart, their third collaboration together, even though the film wasn't at all a success as the other Bogart and Bacall pairings. Dark Passage is mostly remembered nowadays because of the way it was shot, because for the first quarter of the movie we see everything from the perspective of Humphrey Bogart without seeing him on frame, so it was shot subjectively, as you might properly say. This was also mostly to get away with the fact that Humphrey Bogart's character goes through a procedure in which he changes his appearance, and again, while this movie doesn't tend to receive the love that the other Bogart and Bacall pairings have, still you can see the professionality of a director and a screenwriter like Delmer Daves. We also have Agnes Moorehead in the movie, and one of my favorite things is the way the song Too Marvelous for Words, sung by Joe Stafford, is used in the movie. And later on, as I was saying, Delmer Daves in the 50s would achieve cinematic immortality with the westerns I mentioned, then transitioning into romantic dramas starring Troy Donahue. And as I read, this change of pace and this abrupt change of genres came up because his health was declining and filming westerns was too strenuous for him. These movies, these Troy Donahue movies, proved to be very successful. So yet again, another one of these consummate professionals, no matter what the type of movie he was dealing with. And another filmmaker who is probably most remembered for his westerns but who got to direct film noir movies was Anthony Mann, remembered again primarily with his dark 50s westerns starring James Stewart, also heavy on the psychology aspect of the story of the characters with somewhat again dark situations and characters. He got his grip precisely navigating the dark waters of film noir. As many noir fans would know, he got his start directing B-movies in the early 40s for studios such as RKO, Republic Pictures, or a small British-American production company, Eagle Lion Films. Anthony Mann, also like Delmer Daves, was from the US, but he also managed to incorporate into his movies that heavy expressionist style. An example of this was the movie Desperate, released in 1947, which was his last movie at RKO after a bunch of B-movies, a film for which he also got writing credits because it was based on a story that he and Dorothy Atlas had co-written. The atmosphere and the cinematography and the narrative style and the way it is shot anticipate a much more personal kind of film. Also in 1947, the movie Railroaded was released, a movie in which, with the help of its screenwriter John C. Higgins, Anthony Mann's most recognizable thematic traits would start to get more and more solid and would later get visually enhanced by the work of cinematographer John Alton. The three of them would coincide again with the movie T-Men, shot in an almost documentary style produced by Eagle Lion Films. And the three of them would work yet again for the movie Raw Deal, released in 1948, with the addition of the independent producer Edward Small. They created what is considered some of the best noir movies that Anthony Mann got to direct, and is still considered nowadays a very fine example of the film noir genre, style, or movement. With Higgins and Alton, he got to work yet again for the movie He Walked by Night, also released in 1948, but his work went uncredited for that one. And we moved from Winchester 73 to Winchester, Indiana to meet our next director, who is none other than Robert Wise. Known for most people because he was a director of classics dear to me, such as The Sound of Music or West Side Story. Some people don't know that he also had a noir side. Some of you would know that he started working as an editor, first of sound and then of film, and you can see his work credited in some fantastic movies such as Bachelor Mother, My Favorite Wife, in the early 40s, and then the first two Orson Welles movies, which are none other than Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, for which he ended up shooting additional scenes. All of this earned him enough credit to start being offered work as a director, and his first approach to noir was with a movie called Born to Kill, released in 1947 and produced by RKO, featuring Lawrence Tierney, Claire Trevor, and Elijah Cook Jr. in the cast. Born to Kill was an adaptation of James Gunn's novel called Deadlier Than the Male, on a very popular novel, again very successful for James Gunn, but that later on was a bit controversial because of the tone and what happened within the story and the characters. So this film is like nothing you would expect from Robert Wise if you have, again, The Sound of Music in mind. Then he went on to direct a brilliant boxing movie called The Setup, starring Robert Bryan, which was released in 1949, and the one he was most proud of from the movies he directed at RKO. And after shooting the iconic sci-fi film The Day the Earth Stood Still, he shot for a small production company, The Captive City, released a year later in 1952, starring John Forsythe. Towards the end of the decade, Wise started exploring film noir, combining it with more social subjects, which you can see in movies such as Odds Against Tomorrow, a movie which deals with racism. So again, Robert Wise is one of those directors that I don't think you can really classify, but you can really tell anytime you watch one of his movies is that he was a class apart and that he made fine movies, I think, no matter the genre. And moving on to the last of the 5 directors who you wouldn't probably think directed film noir, I'm going to talk about Jean Negulesco, this Romanian-born director whom you probably associate with movies like How to Marry a Millionaire or Three Coins in the Fountain, at least I did, got his start directing film noir. Originally though, his dream was to be a painter, a fine artist, and he moved to Paris in the 20s to achieve that purpose. However, a series of factors came into play, and so he moved to the US. He traveled to the West Coast hoping to get more work, and he got hired by Paramount as a sketch artist and technical advisor, and from that he moved on to directing. A fun early fact that links him to film noir is that he almost got his film debut in 1941 directing The Maltese Falcon, which was John Huston's directorial debut. And funnily enough, the first movie that he got to direct, that Negulesco finally got to direct, was also a film that starred Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet. In fact, he got to direct 3 movies in which they co-starred. After directing a series of shorts, he finally, as I said, got to direct in 1944 The Mask of Demetrios, based on the British writer Eric Ambler's novel A Coffin for Demetrios. While working in Warner Brothers, he also got to make the movie The Conspirators, released also in 1944, featuring Paul Henriette and Hedy Lamarr, a movie that is kind of like a replay or along the lines of Casablanca, but that, surprise surprise, also had Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet in the cast. Given his artistic background, Negulesco continued to create magnificent atmospheric movies with impeccable, of course, art direction, such as Nobody Lives Forever, starring John Garfield and Geraldine Fitzgerald, and Humoresque, again with Garfield and John Crawford. With these movies, he was gravitating more towards the melodrama than film noir, but still again that noirish atmosphere was there. In 1948, after the great acclaim he got for a movie like Johnny Belinda, the drama starring Jane Wyman and Lou Ayres, he switched to the studio that would become the studio of his life, 20th Century Fox, where he got to establish some trademark movies of the studios. But before that, he got to direct one noirish drama such as Roadhouse, released in 1948 and featuring Ida Lupino, Richard Widmark, Cornel Wilde, and Celeste Holm. He also directed Phone Call from a Stranger in 1952, and then a year later he got a major hit with How to Marry a Millionaire, starring, as all of you know, Marilyn Monroe, Lauren Bacall, and Betty Grable. Then came a similar formula, but then transported to Rome with Three Coins in a Fountain. In all his movies, I think, aside from the stylized atmosphere and the fantastic art direction, music in particular plays, I believe, a very important part. And also, in my opinion, Jean Negulesco was also one of those directors whose imprint maybe is not that visible, but once you get to see some of his movies, you get to recognize the talent and the professionality. So here is my tribute to all these directors who I think should be mentioned every now and then. I hope that you enjoyed this topic, that you enjoyed going through, at least I always do, going through overlooked movies, overlooked professionals, and yet again having another excuse to discuss film noir. And if you think that there's still other directors that I haven't mentioned and that you think that also tend to be overlooked and they also made film noir movies, by all means mention them in the comments down below. And in any case, as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your love for classic movies. As always, again, take care, stay safe, and see you all in my next video. Bye!